The first two Terminator movies have been amongst my favourite films since I first saw them as a kid. With a premise that could have easily resulted in mediocre sci-fi action flicks, James Cameron's distinct style and attention to detail explores themes that go way beyond what is typical for the genre. Not to mention, they get extra points from me just for using time travel in an interesting and clever way. On paper, either of these could have just been another Hollywood action movie, and speaking of which, that's pretty much what we've had ever since. That's not to say everything from Terminator 3 onwards is bad, but they definitely take themselves a lot less seriously. It's an action series now, taking advantage of the name value of the franchise as opposed to chasing the high standards it was once known for. Either way, sci-fi action and video games have gone hand in hand since the very beginning. The Terminator should be the perfect franchise to translate into video games, and that fact didn't go unnoticed. Many attempts have been made with varying results. Probably the best pre-PlayStation examples can be found on the PC, in the form of first-person shooters. Now, the original PlayStation didn't see any Terminator games come to it, so we jumped straight up to the PlayStation 2 with Terminator Dawn of Fate, which has a pretty cool cover art, but other than that I don't know much about it. The back suggests it's set in the future, and the 2002 release date puts it at a time when only the first two movies are out, so let's check out Dawn of Fate and see how that is. Essentially, you play the events leading up to the first movie. Cutscenes are often long and eventful, but can range from interesting to really dull. John Connor in particular puts me to sleep when he talks at length, which is a bit of a problem considering he's one of the most important characters in the whole franchise.
We'll get you back into the fight, Captain Perry, but first you should see what Haven sent us. Skynet's newest infiltration unit exactly mimics a human's appearance. These images were recovered from the security system at Oregon Base.
Dawn of Fate takes the form of a third-person action game split into 10 levels, with a list of objectives to complete, of which many just take the form of press this button that's right in front of you, or kill all the bad guys in the room, which you would have never figured out for yourself if the game didn't tell you. So yeah, it's pretty formulaic. Tick the checkboxes whilst moving from one area of the level to the next. There are 3 playable characters in the game, with Kyle Reese being the most notable. Controlling these guys is pretty awkward, and that mostly comes down to 2 things: the camera and the auto-locking system. So starting with the camera, you'll be able to see from the footage that it's a fixed camera perspective. This almost from the outside kinda makes the game look a little bit like a Resident Evil game, especially with the kinda dark, gloomy visuals, but the controls don't match up. So you'll move the direction you're pointing the analog stick in based on the camera perspective as opposed to the character. So if you press down, you go down on the screen. And you're probably thinking that sounds pretty logical, but it can be a problem when the camera angle frequently changes. Suddenly, down is no longer the direction you're originally going. Obviously, this was a problem they noticed in the development of the game because they do try to combat it. If you keep hold of the direction you're moving, you won't suddenly change direction when the camera angle does change, but the moment you stop, the directions are based on the camera perspective again. Sound confusing? Well, this is why other games using this kind of perspective, like Resident Evil, tend to go for the tank-style controls. As awkward and imperfect as they can be, because movement is relative to the character as opposed to the camera angle, forward is always forward, allowing you to move fluidly when the camera angle does change. As for the auto-locking system, luckily it's not nearly as complicated to explain, it's just unreliable. You'll often lock on to random objects, or off-screen enemies when there's already a Terminator right in front of you. You can enter a first-person perspective, but you can't move at the same time, and it's fairly slow, so sadly it's rarely of use, but at least it's an option. Dawn of Fate can get boring quite quickly. It won't take you long to figure out the game primarily consists of killing a large number of enemies and then going through a door to rinse and repeat that in another room. That would be fine, and there are many examples of great games that do just that, but it really relies on a great combat system and fun gameplay, whereas here you lock on and hold the shoot button, plus the issues I mentioned before. The music and atmosphere do embody the Terminator franchise very effectively. It does a pretty good job placing you in the Skynet-controlled year of 2027. The story also fits the franchise pretty well, so it's sad that the actual game that's supposed to hold it all together is fairly underwhelming. Now we enter a time where the games are going to be directly based on the movies and released to coincide with them. First up, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, which has a pretty poor reputation, so I'm not expecting much, but let's give it a go.
Imagine you knew you were going to do something important with your life. Something amazing. Then imagine it never happened. All my life I was trained and prepared for an inevitable war. A war between men and machines. But Judgment Day never came. I guess Doomsday got canned.
Sharing the exact same name as the movie, you'll be unsurprised to know it is based on the movie. So Rise of the Machines has a bad reputation, but at first it doesn't seem like it's as bad as that reputation makes out. The opening cutscene seems pretty high quality and well made for the time, plus the game is a first-person shooter, one of the few genres that the Terminator games have actually succeeded in the past. That is pretty much it though, for the positives. The story is unusual and difficult to follow, which is actually a special kind of failure when that's already been written and done for you in the form of the movie. Some areas of the plot exist, some don't, and without going into much depth, some of those are indeed very important plot points. In-game, everything is ugly, and not in the good post-apocalyptic kind of way, it's just bland and drab to look at. Not that this matters too much anyway, because half of the game is so dark that I need to enter Terminator vision just to figure out where I can and can't go. Originally, I was going to praise the Terminator vision and list it as a kind of cool feature, but I had to rely on it so much as night vision that I got sick of the sight of red. It ends up looking like a Virtual Boy game, and almost hurts your eyes as much. But luckily, whether or not you can see isn't too big of a deal because the targeting system is ludicrously overpowered. You just tap L1 and you'll auto-lock onto anything with perfect accuracy. Basically a built-in aim hack. Now I get that we're playing as a Terminator, so in that regard it does make sense to have that kind of ability, but from a gameplay perspective, this makes every enemy a joke. They've done nothing to try and balance this out. Nothing stands a chance. And it would have made a lot more sense to have this lock-on feature have some kind of limit, as it kind of defeats the purpose of a first-person shooter. With this style of game, aiming is a huge part of the gameplay. The missions themselves are a mess of vague and random objectives.
All the demo teams have checked in. We're set to blow the base. You've got 3 minutes to get out of there.
Understood.
With them getting easier and shorter as you progress through the game. Now I was just about ready to put this game down, when suddenly I'm presented with this. It's like I'm looking at a completely different game. Is this Terminator Tournament Fighter now? Well, actually yeah, kind of. Periodically, you'll enter a one-on-one fight with another Terminator. This is basically this game's version of a boss battle. Why they chose one-on-one fighting for this, I don't know. Punch, kick, throw, and block until someone's life bar hits 0. It doesn't really matter what you do though, it's just a race to see who can slowly walk over to the other quick enough to land some kind of hit. It somehow makes you wish you were playing the FPS again, and that's saying something. They obviously knew they did a bad job with Rise of the Machines, because just 1 year later we get another Terminator 3 game, this time called Terminator 3 The Redemption, so you can see what they were going for there. Now when it comes to this one, it was released, like I said, nearly exactly a year after the first Terminator 3 game, which suggests they started developing this pretty soon after releasing Rise of the Machines. It's difficult to talk about two Terminator 3 games because I just want to call them both Terminator 3. So let's just shut up and play Terminator 3 The Redemption. It can't be any worse than Rise of the Machines at least. Still based on the movie, but this time we've got a third-person action game. In-game cutscenes seem pretty good, and we have a simple upgrade system now. You collect these TB points, or basically a currency based on your performance on each level, which you can spend on upgrades for the Terminator. It's basic stuff, but it's inoffensive. Each level consists of a few objectives, though in reality it's pretty linear. This isn't a problem though, because for the first time, we have a game that's actually pretty awesome. The controls are actually fairly decent for once, and there's a wide range of moves you can use to beat the crap out of enemy Terminators. You can even rip out pieces of the scenery and use them as a weapon. It's pretty cool. There's nothing quite like destroying a Terminator with a signpost. You never see that in any of the movies. You also get a ton of vehicle and on-rail sections as well, and all things considered, they're just as intense and fun to play. Considering you have 3 completely different types of gameplay here, I didn't have any problem adapting to the controls when it would switch up. It was always fairly logical. The on-rails parts would be right at home in an arcade, and it splits between these 3 styles of gameplay often enough that it doesn't ever really get boring. That's not to say Terminator 3 The Redemption is without its flaws though. I did encounter a few bugs, like when I was supposed to be in a car chase with John Connor, but instead his car just freaked out and fell through the floor. Like damn, imagine if he did that in the middle of the movie. Your move, TX. It's also infuriatingly difficult. It's easy to die without knowing exactly what happened, and you get no checkpoints or continues. You have to start the level again from the very beginning when you die, which sucks if that happens right near the end of the stage. Overall though, the intense, fast-paced arcade-style action makes you feel a lot like you're playing through a Hollywood movie, and what more could you ask for from a licensed Hollywood movie title? It's a lot of fun, if a little bit simple, but that kind of matches the source material at this point, and makes for the best Terminator-based game we've seen on PlayStation so far.
Oh my god! John! Dude, look out! Don't look out! Dude, gotta start over. Okay, put this in. Okay, put this in. Steel, 520. Let's move!
Now apparently, in the middle of these 2 Terminator 3 games coming out, there was another game based on Terminator 3. How many games can you have based on one movie sequel? Well, in this case, it was exclusive to the PC, and is somehow even worse than Rise of the Machines on PlayStation 2. So all I can say is I feel lucky that I'm not going to be playing that one. So at least things are starting to look up. Next up comes Terminator Salvation, released on the PlayStation 3 to coincide with Terminator Salvation, the movie. So I was double checking to make sure the release date does actually coincide with the film. 2009, yep, that works, it was released at the same time. I probably should have researched that. But here we go, Terminator Salvation, directly based on the movie, which doesn't tend to be a good sign, but let's see what happens.
I try and remember the world the way it used to be, but it gets harder every day. So many different stories of defeat. So many faces of death.
Despite the title, this is actually set between the events of Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation. Now when it comes to cutscenes, it looks the part, though Christian Bale did not lend his voice or likeness to the game as John Connor, so he now looks pretty generic.
One thing remains constant.
However, once the gameplay kicks in, it's about as bland as it gets. Greys, washed out colours, concrete ruins being the primary set piece, with a bare bones third-person cover-based shooter to attempt to keep you entertained. It's the most sleep-inducingly boring experience 2009 could offer, doing absolutely nothing to attempt to stand out from the crowd. It's one of these games where the default sensitivity when aiming is stupidly slow, but luckily you at least have the option to change it, otherwise it would take hours just to hit anything. For some reason, I keep being asked to press triangle to look. But look at what? It never shows me anything interesting, and I just don't see the point of this. Each chapter is the same dull ordeal. Uninspired room after uninspired room full of the same enemies. 90% of the time you'll be desperately shooting at these small flying machines, which come across as more of a pest than an actual real threat. Once again, a movie-licensed video game that's main priority was to be released concurrently with the film, as opposed to actually being good. The only saving grace for Terminator Salvation is it's an incredibly short experience, 3 to 4 hours at most, and has a famously easy set of trophies to achieve, so if you're a bit of a trophy hunter, you may see some value in this game.
We gotta go! Move, move, move!
After Salvation, we barely saw any Terminator video games get made, or I suppose I'm lying, but it seems like most of them are exclusive to mobile devices. It would be a good 10 years before we get another Terminator game on a home console, and that is Terminator Resistance. It's still a relatively recent game, being released only last year, that's 2019 at this point, so I'm hoping for something pretty good.
On August 29th, 1997, Skynet, a computer system built to protect us, became self-aware. It viewed humanity as a threat to its existence and decided to act. Judgment Day, as we eventually called it, marked war against the machines. Skynet attacks happened almost daily, but the attack that happened on that day was like nothing we'd seen before.
Listen to me if you want to live. Get under that bus.
And following the trends the movies have been taking, we're now ignoring most of the sequels and going back to the future setting seen in Terminators 1 and 2. So in some respect, a similar setting to Dawn of Fate, the first game we looked at. But for that game, it was because the first two movies were the only ones that existed at the time. And in this case, it's because they're ashamed of all the mediocre sequels that they keep releasing. So they're trying to capture the glory of the first two.
Rivers, DN 46890.
Welcome back, Sergeant.
Terminator Resistance is no technical masterpiece by any means, but it is easily one of, if not the best adaptation of the Terminator franchise to make it onto home consoles. Pretty much every gameplay element is ripped straight from another popular game, with little to no attempts to be in any way original or special. But that's okay, not everything has to offer a new unique game-changing experience. Everything you do here will feel very familiar to anyone who's been playing video games for the past decade. First-person shooter, quest-based, semi-open levels, with a leveling up and skill point based system, and the option to focus more on combat or stealth oriented approach to missions. Although not everything here is implemented particularly well, or is even necessary. Crafting, inventory management, the skill points, none of it really needs to be here or even makes that much of a difference. It does kind of feel like a much older game, disguising itself as a modern experience by wearing every popular trope of the current generation of game mechanics. The combat can often be the worst offender. Considering Skynet is supposed to be overwhelmingly powerful, the AI in this game will make you wonder how they ever managed to take over the world in the first place. All the enemies mindlessly walk straight into your gunfire without a care in the world. Now you could argue that's because the Terminators would be fearless, but it doesn't exactly show much in terms of strategy either. The end result is an incredibly easy game, but with all that said, I can't help but enjoy it. The atmosphere created in the future-based scenes from the first two movies have been recreated to near perfection, and the story fits right in too, even if the presentation of it can be a little bit iffy.
I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Ryan. That over there is Erin. She's the doctor of the group. Jennifer's a scavenger, and Colin, well, you can ask him yourself what he thinks he does.
I'm Jacob.
Awkward dialogue at best, and in-game choices that you'll often not even really care about will be your primary hurdles in this regard. That is, unless you opt to witness the embarrassing sex scenes that put a massive spotlight on the fairly poor facial animations and last for an uncomfortably long time. So what Terminator Resistance really boils down to is one question. Can setting and atmosphere be enough to make a game good? And that will be for you to decide. Fan service is rife here, so big Terminator fans like myself will likely forgive the many shortcomings purely to experience this universe in a way that we've hoped to be able to do for decades now.
He's from the Resistance. The others have to be here too.
So I think it's fair to say, as a whole, Terminator video games that came to PlayStation at least are fairly mediocre. Now if I had to start judging them all as a package, let's say we can get rid of Rise of the Machines and Salvation, the ones directly based on movies, immediately. They're worthless. Salvation will only have some value to you if you like to collect trophies, otherwise just avoid it. We can get rid of them. Dawn of Fate has an interesting concept, but the gameplay's fairly mediocre. Actually, I'd say the same for Resistance, it just kind of holds up better because it's newer, but both of these are worth playing if you're a big fan of the Terminator franchise, And then Redemption is pretty good if you just like action games. But then I suppose you could say there's way better action games out there. So for Terminator fans, these are the ones to go for. This is technically a better game, but it's hard to recommend it or to think of an audience that would actually appreciate it for all it's worth, which isn't that much. So you get what I mean. Play one of these, maybe play that, avoid the other two. That's Terminator games.